North American Division standpoint. And so there's a lot of activity that we're engaging in terms of making sure that we can let people know who we are, connect in our community so that hopefully if we were to disappear, they would actually miss us. And to be in a position so when we do want to sit down and actually talk about assistance we need from a religious liberty standpoint, the questions that are not posed to us of who are you and where have you been? And so that's the primary role that we try to take on, is to kind of create a position or a persona, trying to be in a position where our local leaders are familiar with us so that when topics come up, they know that they can call us. There's been many pieces of legislation that we've worked on that afterwards members of Congress would contact us and say things like, we're so glad that you called us, because if we hadn't heard from you, we might have had to move forward the legislation the way it was because we hadn't heard anybody that had an issue with it. So, you know, the ability to create a presence, to create a voice, to be known as a sounding board, to have relationships that you can call on and can call on you, hopefully when decisions are being made that impact the church. And also making sure that everyone understands that at the end of the day, I've already been to the back of the book and I know how this ends. And so the idea of the work that we're doing will be possible to stop some of the things completely that would happen, then that would obviously be violation of prophecy in and of itself. So our work is really to work hard and tarry while we're here, protect our members in every way that we see fit, to try to protect our institutions so that we have a large level of credibility when we're having conversations, and hopefully being very strong in the public affairs side of what we do. So it may make our conversations from a religious liberty side a little bit better. I would be remiss if I didn't mention our team, Bettina Krause, who is the editor of Liberty Magazine, doing a spectacular job. We send a lot of those documents from the magazine out to thought leaders, to political members, to try to keep our community informed on liberty issues. And Melissa Reed, who I mentioned before, is our director of government affairs. And I probably take on more of the role of dealing with our interfaith activities. In other words, we really try to connect with other religious groups. As a matter of fact, on the 18th of January, we are having a prayer breakfast at the North American Division, which is going to be multi-denominational, where literally we have 7 individuals from 7 different denominations come and give prayers on behalf of different activities. And then we have breakfast together. And we do that for about an hour and a half to really kind of connect with those that may be a little bit different from us, and sometimes finding out that we have more in common than we have that may separate us. And so that's the job, kind of like in a nutshell, of how we take it on. We've been kind of at this for a few years. When I first came to the North American Division about 12 years ago, they told me they had not had a director of religious liberty at the NAD for about 13 years prior to that. So it was really trying to come in and kind of build something from scratch. And that's to say that a lot of that work was really being done at the General Conference office in kind of in representation of the North American Division. But now we're kind of taking more of the lead on our own and handling these topics. So that's kind of a little bit of background, a little bit of hopefully a good snapshot of the work that we do.
Okay, thank you so much. And well, first of all, let me also say thank you for being so responsive, Elder Johnson. I sent one email and you responded and indicated that you were willing to join and be a part of the discussion. So if I'm understanding you well, so one scenario or something to which you spoke that comes to mind is the debate, I believe, in the United States, where there was at least some advocacy on behalf of 2 bills, the Equality Act and the Fairness for All Act. I do know that I saw correspondence from either the North American Division or the General Conference that spoke the advocacy of the church in that respect. So does that fall under PAL directly?
It does. And our team kind of takes the lead with that, but we also keep the General Conference involved in what's going on, because they also have a position that is the Washington liaison there, that we try to make sure that they're up to speed on what's happening. So normally when we're advising Elder Bryan on pieces of legislation that we kind of suggest we might want to be involved in, we also try to go and do a briefing for Elder Wilson, who's the president of the World Church as well, so that he can be aware of what's going on. The Equality Act and the Fairness for All Act were really kind of acts that were really talking about the power that would be given to individuals in the LGBTQ plus community. And we were trying to ensure that as those rules and regulations got put in place, that there would be carve-outs to protect religious organizations. And in many of these rules and regulations start to come down the pike, for all intents and purposes, they're not really thinking about us off the bat. So you almost have to go in and kind of push and shove a little bit, get yourself in the room, let them know what the issues are, because sometimes they'll look at you and say, well, we don't think there's an issue for you. And sometimes the issue is a little bit nebulous, but you can make an argument as to see how you might get drawn into it. So, sometimes our job is like, well, it looks like you got belts on, but sometimes belts and suspenders might make us even a little bit more secure. And sometimes the game plan, and I'm sure Jonathan has been down this road before, where you have groups that'll tell you got nothing to worry about, we're fine. But then you want to come back and say, well, I'd like to see that actually down in documentation somewhere to ensure that, I guess what we would simply call, we trust but verify all at the same time. And so the Fairness for All was really kind of an expansion of some of the language that was going on with the Equality Act to ensure that religious groups and religious organizations would be protected. And it was very similar to a document that was called the Utah Compromise, which was something that had taken place in Utah that at the state level had put something very similar in place. And so our goal was to really kind of push our own pieces of legislation, because whenever you go in and mention that you have a problem, one of the things that can be really helpful is you actually put together the language that could potentially solve the problem and find someone who might be willing to be your advocate from a legislative standpoint. And that kind of also ended up happening when we ended up dealing with the Marriage Act that we were working on, in which we were very involved, and Senator Susan Collins was really helpful in getting us some language changes that we need. But, I would almost call that kind of like a light version of what they were looking for in the Equality Act, but it gave us at least some of the cover that we thought we needed to really be helpful to our organizations. But just to be clear, one of the things that we try to do at the North American Division, we work through our union par directors. We try not to kind of like extend down into the churches. We deal with the unions, so they deal with the conferences, and the conferences deal with the pastors. And so we try to make sure that we're not what I would call bigfooting our views, but we try to hopefully provide the resources that may be necessary so that people in the pews might be able to do what they'd like to do and be great representatives in the area of public affairs and religious liberty.
Excellent. So, my recollection, just to establish the importance of the work that you do, of the discourse, and I think this was maybe 2 years ago, when I first saw that we were involved in making our voice heard about our preference. I believe it was the Fairness for All Act. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but basically what it did is that it would have preserved our rights as a church to protect our religious or place or institutions, as well as churches or facilities, and so that they could not be used and we could not be forced to have them used by organizations, individuals that do not represent what our principles are. Is that
right?
An idea?
That's a great observation, and because there's some really nuanced activities that go on. So, for example, say for example, the pastor and you guys decide that you want to allow your church to be used by maybe homeschool children in your community. And you decide this is an opportunity for homeschool kids to get together. They can, have a chance to see other children. Well, in the US, you could look at that and somebody could say, well, listen, if you're doing that, that's not exactly tied into the mission of your church. Maybe what you have now done is created your church into being a public space. And if it's become a public space, then that means there might be other people in the public who would like to come and use that space. And when they come to approach you to use that space, you may be uncomfortable with who they are and what they're about, but they come back and say, well, you let this other group who's not a religious group connect with your church. So it feels as though it's got created into being a public space. So if you become a public space, I don't know if you actually have the right to tell me no, based on the fact that you may just be generally uncomfortable with me. Now, that's a stretch as to where some of these things can go. But part of what we like to do is make sure that you tie up the possibilities of even that type of stuff happening. You know, we have a situation, for example, my church in Washington, D.C., where there's a lot of concerns regarding Airbnbs. And our church happens to have a building across the street where we do counseling. But at the top, we have a 2-bedroom Airbnb that we use to kind of offset our costs. Well, we tried to work with our legislative people to find out if we could find an exemption for religious organizations. You know, we're not trying to put hotels out of business, but this is just kind of part of what we do from a counseling standpoint. And we bought the building with that as being an income stream. Well, we're still working through that concept, but hopefully in the relationships we have, we should get an exemption. But those are the types of things that come down the pike that on the outside looking in, it may not feel as though there's a religious component that's in place, but you also want to make sure that the laws that you are getting are kind of broad enough so it also will include those things that maybe you can't see today that kind of pop up a little bit later on. So that's just kind of one of the examples.
Okay, thank you so much. There are, I want to bring Elder Zirkle in. My first question that I have for him really concerns Canadian law, and I know that he's an attorney in the US. So hopefully he'll be able to give us a great answer. But one last thing here before we move on, Elder Johnson, where can members find resources? You know, most of our members obviously are here in Canada. Where can we find CARL resources? I realize that online there are resources where individuals can access letters for exemption.
Sure. A lot of our resources are available if you go to the North American Division's website and go to the Parle Department. We try to make available, we have as a Parle manual for our pastors that usually distributed, that gives you an idea of potential things that you can do in terms of protecting your members, how you can assist in terms of wanting to be engaged in your community, how to make sure that we can kind of assist you but not push you too far out there so you find out that you're actually across the line in any way, because sometimes it's easy to get started and sometimes it's tough to stop to try to roll that rock back up the hill. And so what we try to do is hopefully provide enough information. We try to also get you connected with your union Parle directors, because all the unions have a different focus. You know, one union may be focusing more on legislation in the capitals. Other unions may be focusing more on what they do with local legislation. Some of them are focusing more on different areas. So with 9 different Parle directors, you have to kind of view things a little bit differently. And to be honest, the law in Canada is a lot more developed as it relates to a lot of these religious liberty issues than really they are in the United States. So that even creates even a little bit more of a nuance. And then we find ourselves even in Guam and Micronesia assisting them on similar topics because, you know, they are, you know, really a U.S. territory, but in the same breath, we want to make sure that, you know, they're getting protected out there as well.
Okay, and we will put in the link, in the chat, sorry, the link to the Canadian Ontario Conference and NAD websites where you can find a lot of this information. Here, what I plan to do next is actually invite in our director at the Ontario Conference, and so individuals will be able to have a discussion with them as well and learn some more about how we can access these resources and what we should be expecting from the conference. So thank you so much, Elder Zirkle. My question to you is, and perhaps you can speak to this, I mean, some persons are on from the US as well, from the US perspective as well, but what are the, where do we find, for those of us who are in Canada, for example, and the US, where do we find, what is the basis of the religious liberty rights of our members based on Canadian law? And also, I wanted to ask you whether there's any legal basis for the general suspension of these rights.
Yeah, well, I'm from California and well trained in American U.S. law, so I can't really answer your Canadian question. Although I've associated with some Canadian attorneys, especially during this pandemic, and they assure me that while some of the actual foundation is different, the concepts are the same. Basically, if you really look at the religious liberty rights, they come from the United States Constitution. They come from the amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Also, it also is kind of in the way that we wrote the Constitution. If you look at the U.S. Constitution, it really leaves religion out, and then we are in a government of limited government, at least what we were supposed to be. Things have changed a lot in the last 100 years. But really, those rights, if you really are a student of political science, argue that those rights don't come from the U.S. Constitution. They come from us because we were made in the image of God. And any powers that our government has are powers that we have given to the government. It's not a situation where the government has the right to give us rights. Are God-given rights. You can see that in the U.S. Declaration of Independence. But be that as it all may, as a practical matter, you're going to go back and you're going to argue the First Amendment as far as where your rights go for. As far as suspension of those rights, the founding fathers, they were living in tumultuous times. They're through revolutions themselves. Very, very aware of the idea that there's pandemics were not new during that time, and had every possibility to put in some kind of an exception in the U.S. Constitution for a suspension of rights. And so there is no provision in law for suspension of rights. And that makes a lot of good sense when you think about where your rights come from, because rights come from God. The rights in the United States, in some ways, were suspended during the Civil War, and in many ways, that's a black mark on President Abraham Lincoln's record. And we can also see where it's been suspended in other times, like, for instance, during World War II, when we interned the Japanese members of the Japanese race that were here in America, some of them citizens, many of them citizens. That's a black mark on our history, something that we should be ashamed of, and we should learn from that and understand that rights really are not something to be suspended. If a right can be suspended, it's really not a right at all. It's just a convenience.
So much. Well, as you mentioned here in Canada, well, we wanted to have on an attorney here from Canada. Unfortunately, we were not able to have her on the panel. I'm not sure if she is here in the chat, but she can also respond. She knows what I'm referring to. But here in Canada, my understanding is that these rights, well, first I want to embrace what you said. As Christians, Seventh-day Adventists, you know that these rights come from, you know, and the government and the legislative arm of government, judiciary, to be more specific, but both are charged with ensuring that, you know, the laws, as are agreed by the people in what is usually referred to our societies as free democratic societies, are responsible for ensuring that the people are protected and the protections are maintained. Here in Canada, my understanding is that from a constitutional law perspective, these rights fundamentally emanate from the Constitution, as opposed to the US. Here in Canada, we actually have the 1982 Constitution, where in Section 2, one of the fundamental freedoms based on the Charter is the freedom of conscience, and it does say religion. So that's very specific, specifically stated. And here in Canada, even during the pandemic, and we'll talk a little bit openly about the pandemic as well, there were a few challenges to some government mandates on religious grounds, as well as on the grounds of the perceived violation of some of the other rights, for example, mobility rights, and so on and so forth. And some of these cases actually did not make it all the way to the Supreme Court, but they were basically aborted. Well, one of the courts basically had a declaration that the point was a moot point because the government had actually removed the mandates. So we did experience that somewhat, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. From your experience, what happened in the US, we'll ask you to share that as well. But fundamentally, as you said, it is important to appreciate that these rights do come from God. And even if the state does make laws that are contrary to that, then it is important for us to appreciate that we have the right regardless. And that sounds probably a little tricky to some individuals, but I would say it that way. Regardless, we do have the right to our religious freedom and our liberty to worship God as He has prescribed in His Word, and that this right is also not just collective, but we have that individual right as well. And so I have a few questions that I want to ask Pastor Smith to comment on, but haven't gotten to them yet. So I'll just go to my next question first. But of course, Pastor Smith, you can comment if you so choose at any point, please. Thank you very much. So my next question is, are my religious liberty rights limited to the doctrines and position of the church on a religious liberty issue or question? And I'll ask either of our guests can respond to this question. And the reason for this question is because primarily, for example, during the course of the pandemic, this was like a very sore point that arose for many individuals, because whereas government mandates in the United States and in Canada were very specific in requiring that individuals explicitly indicate that their objection to some government mandates were based on the beliefs of the church, and they were required to articulate specifically and to show that the church believed what they individually believed. And that was a very, very sore point. So I will ask either of our guests to answer that question. Are my religious liberty rights limited to the doctrines and positions of the church on any religious liberty issue or question?
I'll take a crack at it. I almost look at it as a trick question. But
okay, just one moment. I'm not sure if I'm the one who is not hearing you so well, or if others are not hearing you. Can you hear him very well? Or they can't hear you? Okay, so we're not hearing you very well, Elder Zirkle. I'm not sure if you're able to change your position, but you're coming in a little bit more.
To my mic, does that help?
Yes.
Did that help?
Yes, that sounds better.
Okay, I'll say.
Okay, no, it sounded better at first, but no, wait, it sounded better at first, but then it's gone again. So,
I can try to do it over my phone.
Yes, if you could do that, then that would be perfect. Because, well, hopefully it would be perfect, because usually the data is sometimes better than the Wi-Fi. So you could log in with your phone, but in the interim, Elder Johnson, do you want to take a crack at that?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think there was clearly a lot of sore points as related to the vaccine mandates, and I think a big part of it was everyone trying to figure out what would be the right interpretation in terms of protecting individuals and protecting the church at the same time. Title VII, which is really of the Civil Rights Act of '64, is really what kind of creates the information that basically an employer is not allowed to refuse you an accommodation, and the law used to be unless it could show an undue hardship. And religion is kind of defined very broadly, which it includes kind of like mainstream religions, but it also includes kind of smaller religions. And one of the ironies of being Seventh-day Adventists is, we have about 1.2 million Adventists in the North American division, and probably about 1 million Adventists in the United States. There's probably about 8 million Mormon in the United States, 30 million Southern Catholic, 90 million, Catholic, 30 million Southern Baptist, maybe 7 million Lutheran, 5 million. So for all intents and purposes, we're considered to be kind of a small religion from a U.S. perspective. And I think one of the things that we wanted to focus on is the way the law is crafted is the moment you kind of let somebody know that there's an issue with their quote unquote accommodation, that the employer now has the onus of trying to accommodate you. And the accommodation should take place whether you're part of a big religious group, small religious group, unrecognized religious group. So people who are trying to have you to justify your religion in order to protect you from a Title VII perspective, from our opinion, that wasn't how the law is crafted. And the idea of trying to come in and justify what your religion is exactly the opposite of what we want to be doing. We want you to be able to go in, regardless of what your religion is, and ask for your accommodation because you're allowed to have that personal belief. I think one of the struggles came when we had people who are used to getting letters regarding Sabbath accommodation. And I think we can all agree that, the Sabbath is a primary doctrine of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And I guess our concern is that if we put out something on the letterhead of the Seventh-day Adventist Church that really, what I would call memorialize an individual's personal belief, that there could be a possibility that people would look at that and also think that that personal belief is the belief of the church. I'll give you a perfect example. If I were to poll everyone here today and say exactly how do you keep the Sabbath, there may be some people who would say we don't cook on the Sabbath. And there might be other people who say we do cook on the Sabbath. There's some people may say we go out to dinner and eat at restaurants on the Sabbath. Others may say we don't do that. I couldn't ever put out something that says that your personal belief of how you keep the Sabbath is in keeping with the Seventh-day Adventist Church because how you go about that is between your personal relationship with you and God. But nor would I want to put something out there where somebody would say, oh, Adventists are good at going to restaurants on Sabbath, or Adventists are good at doing this. I mean, we have people who are doctors that people would say, well, if you're a doctor, you are allowed to work on Sabbath because, as one person told me, your religion has a loophole. Well, it's still, if you're a doctor and you don't want to work on Sabbath, you should be able to have that right as well because that's your own personal belief, regardless of what any other doctors may be doing. So that was kind of how we tried to put this in place, and how we moved forward was kind of based on a decision by senior leadership in consultation with other groups. And we just decided that we thought that might be the easiest way to kind of move forward and not spend a lot of our time on ringing the bell. Like a good example is when I think it was the president of American Airlines was online, and somebody asked him, well, do you know of any religions that are against vaccinations? And he was like, yeah, I think the Seventh-day Adventist Church is. And then, now you got to spend all this time saying, whoa, time out. That's not exactly true. And so trying to figure out how to hopefully be protective, not spend a lot of time trying to unring the bell, but in the same breath, making sure that you're assisting people to kind of protect their individual rights, but not document that everyone's individual rights is quote unquote a doctrine of the church. And I think that was the balance that we were trying to do. But we clearly understand when you're in the midst of tough situations and people are asking you to do things you don't want, I get, that it's going to be upset. And I have my own personal beliefs on whether I want to be vaccinated or not. And I think everybody should make their own call. And I think even from our standpoint, we were like, yeah, well, there are people who think you should, there are people who think that you shouldn't. But I think it was one of our last sentences in our document. It's like, but at the end of the day, it's your call.
So I noticed you answered two questions in one.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to come back a little bit to the latter part, but to the initial question, my takeaway from what you're saying is that our religious rights are not limited, you can correct me if I'm wrong, to the doctrines and positions of the church. The advocacy of the church on my behalf in that situation is something we want to discuss a little bit further. But generally speaking, legally, my religious liberty rights, you're saying, are not limited to the doctrine and position of the church. In other words, I can request an exemption, or I can, based on my own personal conviction on the subject, even if the church does not have that public position, the authorities and the employer ought to still make accommodation for that personal conviction. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think you have a lot of employers that what we find out will tell you, no, we require X, when in reality, the law does not require you to require X. And being able to push back and make sure that they understand that the onus is actually on them to accommodate unless they can show, and the law has changed somewhat. Initially, it was about undue hardship, but, you know, and now that's kind of changed to more of a minimal impact kind of thing. That the reality is that we don't want anyone pushing back and trying to push back the laws in a way that it's been crafted, because most of those laws are really protected of smaller organizations. And if you look at the numbers of who we are in the United States, not who we are from a world church perspective, we're kind of a minority-sized religion in the US. And the current laws that are there probably protect us more than it protects a lot of other major religions.
Okay, well, thank you.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yeah. You can go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay, I can hear you, but unfortunately it's still breaking up. I'm not sure why.
So I have my phone called in, but it won't unmute.
Oh,
So when I talk to my phone, it doesn't. I think if you look on the thing, I'm down here, one of the telephone numbers that called in, and I think you
647, is that one? 712?
This Jonathan on the screen there, I think is me. I think that Zoom knows my name. Okay. It's a 909 number.
Okay. You're talking through now. You're saying that you're using a phone. You called it.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I have the phone next to it.
Says Jonathan.
I'm talking.
Okay.
I'm talking over the main.
He's at the bottom of the page, Leon. If you go down,
one is what I saw where phone is.
Yeah. So I can only ask you to unmute. Currently, I can't unmute. So do you see something appearing on your phone saying unmute?
There we go. There we go.
Okay, so now you're echoing. So you could mute the other one and just use the phone.
How does that sound now?
Yeah, I mean it's good enough. Yeah.
Okay. So sorry about the technical difficulties. I think it's probably on my end. But what I was going to say is that as a real practical difficulty, employers and even government agencies are constantly looking to say, like we just heard, the American Airlines president wanted to know if there were any churches that had an objection to this, and they're constantly looking to the churches to see. And the reality is that if I have a client that wants to exert a religious liberty objection to something, if there's no church who will even recognize it as being in the realm of religious liberty issues, then it's harder for them to do that. And you know, one of the things that I think that I have to respectfully disagree with Elder Johnston is that I don't think it causes any confusion if the church were to support its members on this. And I just point to one of the things that our church did recently, which was we went out and filed amicus briefs and were very supportive of, I believe it was a hijab that wanted to be worn at, I believe it was Abercrombie and Fitch. And, you know, the religious liberty principles are there. It's a good set of religious liberty principles. But I don't think anybody would confuse Adventists as being supportive of hijabs. And in fact, you could also make a lot of really good arguments that Adventists shouldn't support hijabs at all, because some people would say that a hijab is not so much of a religious issue as a woman's right issue in that society. And then you get into really complex things. So what I would say is that we've been able to participate in extremely complex moral, religious arenas, and then to sit back and say, well, we don't think people are going to be able to understand as an excuse not to participate. I think that was one of the frustrations that my organization and myself personally had, and I know that a lot of Seventh-day Adventists had with our church on that issue. And one of the other things that was particularly difficult for church members was the statement on the GC webpage that explicitly stated that Seventh-day Adventists should not exert a religious liberty claim, implying that a Seventh-day Adventist couldn't have a legitimate religious belief opposed to vaccinations. And I believe that I've never seen anything about whether someone believes in vaccines or not as being anything that's related to our 28 fundamental beliefs. And it just to me, I don't know. It was this kind of thing that caused Religious Liberty and Health Alliance to come into existence to try to stand in the gap.
Yeah, I think there's a good point to be made regarding, because one of the things that we have to kind of do at the North American Division is, there's this thing, if the General Conference says something, then is that the North American Division saying something? And do the North American Division have the power to kind of stop the General Conference from doing certain things? So, what we try to do from time to time is to come out with statements. But I can tell you the long and the short of it is, it doesn't matter what statement the North American Division ever comes out with, half the people are going to be upset because at the end of the day, we're not a monolithic religious group in which there's just one thing that comes down the middle. I mean, the idea that individuals would say, listen, if the church puts out a letter that says that I'm a Seventh-day Adventist and my religious beliefs, say that I shouldn't be vaccinated, I can see someone saying, well, we don't see any reason why anybody would come back and say that based on that letter that the Seventh-day Adventist Church supports or has a problem with vaccination. But on the other hand, I could easily see where somebody could look at that and come to a conclusion that, well, this sounds like something that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is protecting. The other part of it is one of the things, at least from my perspective as we work, when we're going out and trying to get protections and exemptions for religious groups, from a religious perspective, one of the things that we're also trying not to do is to overplay our hand. Because if you go somewhere and you're trying to get an exception for every potential thing that comes down the pike, you want to make sure that you've got enough credibility that there are some issues that are extremely important. Now, mind you, people's conscientious beliefs and their contrary views that, they believe from a religious standpoint, they should be protected at all times. The idea that you needed to have something on the letterhead of your church or the conference or the union in order to do so, our viewpoint as it came down from the top was, we don't think that's something that's necessary. Now, if you had people getting letters, might that have made their lives a little bit easier? I guess there's a possibility of that, but it's also a question of, some people will say, well, that wouldn't make the division of life any more difficult. But I can't tell you the number of people that we have to deal with things on a regular basis where they draw certain extrapolations. And yeah, you try to clarify it the best way you can. And sometimes you can do it without much headache. And sometimes it does create a little bit more headache. And it was just kind of like the thought process was, well, if it's personal, let's help them write their personal letter. Let's give them the law. Let's get them everything they need. But in the same breath, whatever you do, there are people who are going to want to see more. And there are other organizations that probably get set up to handle more. But I would just say that I'm not sure that the division thought it was in a position to be able to do so at the time. But there being a difference of opinion and people thinking there should have been more or less or whatever the case may be, I completely understand that. And I think those are the type of dialogues we should always have.
Right. Thank you so much. Okay, yes. Pastor Smith, go ahead.
I like the position that Elder just presented. COVID, as you highlighted earlier, because the question was coming from way back, as you highlighted, COVID presented an opportunity for us, not just looking back at what transpired, but Elder Johnson spoke about that. We have looked at the back of the book and we know what will eventually happen. So COVID presented us an opportunity to learn from that experience and develop a framework, a better framework going forward, because a lot of the members felt that the church was not supportive. And to
Right.
some extent that we didn't lend the hand that they required for that support. But now we have a framework that we can build on, that in the event when it happens, or when the other situations arise, we have a template of how we can protect our members, so we can support our members going forward. And I think Jonathan was trying to hint at that as well.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And to be honest, we could make suggestions as to how we think something should be. And the North American division does not really have the power to stop 4,500 pastors from doing whatever they're going to do on a week-to-week basis. Usually the role that we have is we're called upon to kind of give our thoughts. And once we give our thoughts, then, the unions and the conferences kind of decide how they're going to move forward. It was kind of similar to in the United States when COVID money started going out, right? So we were asked, and usually when we have to weigh in, it's not because we just want to weigh in, it's because we're getting asked to weigh in. And so when the question was, well, should conferences and unions be accepting COVID money? Well, our response was like, well, listen, we can't tell you what to accept and what not to accept, but we also don't know what all the strings that may be attached in order to do something like that. So be prayerful in how you would go about doing it and then move forward. And there were some groups that even before we even responded already got the money. So, it becomes, at some point, you still have to let organizations that are independent make their own decisions, decide what they want to do. You can make recommendations how you see might be the best way to handle it. But unions and conferences either accept our guidance or they don't accept our guidance. And there are lots of times they don't. And so, but we understand our role is to hopefully try to give the best messaging that we think would be helpful. And then, but at the end of the day, the General Conference doesn't tell the NAD what to do. The NAD doesn't tell the unions what to do. How the unions and conferences interact is also a very unique situation as well. So, but I will tell you one other thing, Pastor, just to kind of throw something out there. One of the big issues I worked on in Maryland was that churches were not considered to be essential service organizations during COVID. Now, that's where I found myself spending a lot of time. And if you can explain to me why a liquor store has to be open all the time, but somehow my church can't be open, then that's a problem that I have. Or if I can have 25 people going into a liquor store, why do I only have 10 people that can go into a church? If there's a time where I really need my pastor going around seeing his members is in the midst of a pandemic, and you're telling me that because church service is not an essential service, my pastor can't go congregate and things of that nature. Well, in Maryland, we ended up getting more regulations in place now where churches and their activities are considered to be essential services. So, that's also kind of, as you talk about a template that gets created that kind of allows us to be in a better position moving forward. Because if you had told me before the pandemic that I could go buy all the liquor I wanted, but I couldn't go in and see my pastor on a Sabbath, I would have thought you were crazy. But that's exactly how the law was crafted. And so, trying to figure out how to juxtapose all these different positions, I think is helpful. But I also think that the difference of opinions and the conversations regarding it are helpful. I don't think there's any one line going down the pike. Jonathan mentioned the case with Abercrombie and Fitch. I mean, we also put in a document that clearly was supporting this woman and her hijab, and we viewed it from the standpoint that they were saying it violated their looks policy. And from our perspective, if you're going to say that what somebody believes that they are doing for religious purposes is violating your looks policy, we think that's a bridge too far. And, but then somebody else may look at it and say, no, we don't see it that way. And that's to be respected. But, but the key is I think you have to be willing to make a statement when necessary. And there's sometimes that the best thing the North American division can try to do is not make a statement, is to let groups decide on their own how they want to move forward. But sometimes you get so much pressure from your unions that they want you to make a statement. That's why sometimes these things happen the way they do.
Right. But thank you.
So, I would just like to chime in.
Yeah, please.
I feel like it's a little bit shirking your responsibilities to kind of take an attitude of, well, people will do what they want to do. I mean, this is the role of advocates. The role of an advocate is to get in and actually advocate so that people don't do just what they feel like they want to do. And I think that one of the things that was a little tough for me, maybe I saw it from a little bit different angle this pandemic than you did, but I had people coming to me that were losing their jobs. And I'm not talking about people outside the church. I'm talking about people inside the church. People and the way hierarchies work, the people at top can make changes and they can stop that kind of thing. But yet that absolutely didn't happen. And from the highest levels, one person in particular, I believe, was terminated from the very, very highest levels. And what I see the Religious Liberty Department should have been doing, in all respect, is you need to be whispering in the ears of the pastors that are running the show, explaining to them the religious liberty issues. The biggest travesty, though, is not the people that were losing their jobs. The biggest travesty in my mind were the students that were going to school that were being forced to take the vaccine. I remember one client, I got a telephone call and I was told I was going to get a client, and they said that this girl had put in her religious exemption at one of our colleges. It was denied. She went and got the shot. She was immediately admitted to the hospital with a reaction to the shot. And when she got out, she wanted to still go back to school. The school said, no, you have to take the second shot. And she thought, well, they denied my religious liberty shot, so I'll make a medical excuse based on the previous shot. Well, they denied that too. And then she took the second shot. Praise God, there was no adverse reaction to the second shot. But I think to myself, there's no cure for stupid. If you have this kind of situation, she shouldn't be taking that shot. And my biggest concern is when I look at her, she's probably 19, 20 years old. I don't know what year she was in college. She lacks that knowledge of good sense that older adults have. And we owe a duty to protect these people. And instead, we're forcing a shot on people that really have very little, if nothing, to benefit because, frankly, the disease does not pose a risk to them. And in hindsight, we can see that none of these shots really benefited much of anyone. This will be something that we are going to be sorting out for a long, long time. But I also don't think that it's outside the realm of Seventh-day Adventist belief that our body is the temple of God and that we are to take care of it. And, I would expect my church to come to my defense if my employer said I had to smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol. I don't understand. It's the same principle for protecting the body. It's just a different substance. It's just one that we haven't traditionally been concerned about. But it's not so much that we're concerned about vaccines, perhaps, as it is that we're concerned about unsafe vaccines. And there's a piece of knowledge, an idea that says truth is the daughter of time. These vaccines, we still to this very day don't know the safety issues that are involved. So to force something on this, and yet I know people who were planning on getting the vaccine and then they prayed about it and were convicted as a matter of prayer, not church doctrine, just a conviction as a matter of prayer to not take the vaccine, and they didn't take it. And then they were accused of somehow misusing their religious rights because they wouldn't take that vaccine. I think about people that maybe pray about getting on an airplane. I know one particular story where there were some missionaries that were going to get on an airplane, and they didn't get on the airplane because God convicted them not to. That plane crashed. And I'm saying, did they have a religious liberty right not to get on that airplane? I say absolutely. And I think that we discount people's religious liberties way too quickly in this pandemic. And the real question should be, what are we going to do differently? What would we do different? In hindsight, can we see if we did anything wrong? We have to have that discussion.
Thank you.
Well, let me just say, in hindsight.
Okay, I wanted to referee a little bit.
Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I don't really have much of a statement. I'm just saying, always 2020, right? You can always look back and say, if I could do things a little bit differently. But I think the real concern that we have is, the idea that we would want to help somebody protect their religious freedom. And that sometimes even trying to help people to protect their religious freedom, bad things end up happening. I don't think anybody wants to see anything bad happen. But I think also when you're out in the forefront and you're fighting for certain rights that you believe in, sometimes bad things end up happening. Now, the idea of what we can do to quote unquote protect an individual, I wish I could tell you that I'm the end all be all and I decide what's going to happen and that's how it's going to take place. But when a leadership group gets together and looks at things and as a group they come to a conclusion, because I'm no health official. I don't know anything about vaccines. I made my own decisions on what I was going to do with the vaccine. And, you know, and when health groups and religious groups get together and they end up making a policy decision and it comes down the pike, that policy decision is what the team ends up working with. And I can understand that there'll be people who will have difference of opinions and say, well, it should have gone this way or it shouldn't have gone that way. I'm sure that there's probably dozens of decisions that have been made that you have to do on behalf of the team that you can come back and say, you know, I wish it would have gone a different way. But I think at the end of the day, there's limited power that you have at the end of determining what an organization is going to do. And when the top says it's doing X, and that may not be the best result, but that's kind of how some of these policies get created. And, you know, and trying to find a good, hopefully nuanced position to help is what we try to do. And I think, you know, but in the same breath, you know, listen, this isn't going to be a perfect scenario. Are there going to be other groups that should be stepping in to try to protect things that you aren't able to protect? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, I don't think anyone wants to be trying to harm individuals, but you also want to be trying to be consistent in your process of how you go forward. And that was, I think, a lot of the goal. But to say that this is a unanimous opinion among Adventist leadership, that this is exactly how something should work, I don't know if there's very much that falls into that category, to be honest.
All right. So I love the fact that the Seventh-day Adventist Church is not the Catholic Church. So we can respectfully disagree. And and that's the thing. That's one of the things that I think was kind of got lost during the COVID period as well. There were many spaces, even in churches, where the conversations that were happening now was basically not allowed. And the reason I started the discussion by referencing my childhood is because I found that to be very strange and different from the church that I grew up in. And there were times when I was like, is this like the Twilight Zone? But just to wrap up this question, to go directly to the next question that you have already both given your answers to, I just wanted to cement this. So the question was, you know, does the employer have a right to require me to prove that my belief is my church's belief, and my church's belief in black and white, in order for it to recognize my religious exemption? And that the flat out answer to that is no. It is wrong. It is illegal. And I realized here in Canada, because just like Jonathan, well, not like I shouldn't try to equate the two, but there's a self-funded ministry that I'm a part of as well, and it's called Time Science. And we also had individuals that came to us asking for help because of the situations that they were in. And one of the common themes was that employers, especially here in Canada, were demanding and asking that individuals show that the church supported or that their position against vaccination and against other mandates were consistent with the church's belief. And I recognize that in almost every letter that I know that was sent to the employers, indicating that here in Canada, that's not right. You can't ask me to prove that. I noticed that most employers did not respond to that part of the letter, completely ignored it. Here in Canada, there's a 2000 case by the name of Syndicate Northwest and Amsterdam. And in that particular case, it was a Jewish, was about individuals who are part of the Jewish faith. And the court specifically held that freedom of religion should be regarded, not freedom of religion, my apologies, should be regarded as a personal, and this went to the Supreme Court again, and this is what they tell you, that freedom of religion should be regarded as a personal or subjective freedom. And as such, the claimant need not ground his claim in any objective religious obligation, requirement, or precept to invoke freedom of religion. All that must be demonstrated is sincerity of the belief. And in that case, they actually won, because the court basically said that they did not have to prove that where they desired to put their sukkah or their tent to celebrate this Feast of Tabernacles had to be something that they had to show from the Jewish faith, that as Jews, that the faith had this position and their position was consistent with the position of their faith. The church said no. All that they had to do was to show that it was their sincerely held belief. And so when individuals in Canada were trying to establish that, listen, even though some employers, as Elder Zirkle said, went onto the General Conference and other websites and pulled down that extract and shared, I know a personal case where they actually shared that in their response. They didn't respond in relation to what was shown to them about Canadian law, where they were doing what they were doing was illegal, but they still went onto the church's website, pulled that thing down, and said, see, your church is saying that you do not have this exemption. And we just wanted to establish in this conversation that that was wrong. And if we are to have another pandemic, it is still wrong, as far as I know current law to be, and the Constitution. And that was also a telltale sign of the spirit that was at play in the pandemic, where organizations, public and private, seemed to have colluded on that point and made a demand of individuals that was actually illegal. Then I want to jump to the question that you were both answering just now. And I think the thing, Elder Johnson, that many individuals still struggle with, and as Pastor Smith said, we have a template. Well, it is my hope, it is the hope of many individuals, that there is a template that will actually see an adjustment in the approach. And I'm going to talk about it from this perspective. So some members in other divisions, like Inter-American Division, were unable to obtain exemption letters signed by SDA pastors, and also in North American Division, and either had to seek letters from Sunday church ministers or be fired from their job. So I know of a particular case for example, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where I have a friend who actually faced this situation. He was employed by the government, and the government said, you must take these vaccines. And so they had to specifically bring a letter from the church, signed by the church. So they weren't willing to accept the letters signed by the individuals themselves, meaning that even if the church assisted the individual in writing the letter, the fact that it did not have the endorsement of the pastor, which again is illegal in any event, the position of the government was illegal, then they couldn't get the exemption and they had to be laid off without pay. And this is a gentleman who is an ardent worker in the church. And you know what? He actually lost his job and he was not able to get that exemption. But other colleagues of his were able to get that exemption because they were Methodists, because they were Baptists, because they were whatever, and their pastors were able to sign the letter. So I think and hopefully you'll allow me to say this and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think part of what Elder Zirkle is saying is that just like these churches were able to have a kind of a flexible enough approach, where their pastors were able to sign, that should have been the approach generally across the world of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But I do recognize and appreciate what you said, Elder Johnson, because with respect to what you said about the division not necessarily dictating. And that it's important for me to hear that from you, because that is important, because I wanted to ask you that question too. So to tack on to the end of that question, and I know I've been going for a little while, but I'm wrapping up now. I also know of another case where this specific individual is a nurse in Detroit, in the United States. And I was kind of wondering what was happening, because here it was that individuals in Canada, individuals in Ontario, it appeared as if, and I do not want to use any specific references by calling any names, but I got information from very, very confidential pastoral sources that it seemed to be a prohibition or a restriction on pastors signing these letters. But in Ontario, but in Detroit, for example, I know of a particular case where this nurse, she was willing to walk off the job if she was not accommodated. And her pastor was like, hey, no. Whatever you need, come to me. I will write the letter and I will sign the letter. And he wrote it, he signed it, and she was able to take it to the employer and get the exemption. So my question was, as I contended with people asking questions and us trying to, help individuals and directing them to Liberty and Health Alliance and all these things, was what accounted for this lack of uniformity in response. In one area, an individual would lose their job because the pastor would not sign the letter. In another division, the pastor did not even wait until the individual approached them. The pastor comes to the church and says, whoever needs a letter, just let me know. I will sign it. And so what do you think? And this question now goes to Elder Johnson. What accounted? Is it what you were saying before? That
Well,
it's not so they were free to have their own position?
No, it's exactly what I'm saying, that if I sit down with 5,000 pastors in the North American division and say, we think this is a bad idea, trust me, there's a group of them that are going to be like, we don't feel that way. We're going to do what we think we need to do. And to be honest, there's a little bit of, understanding that you don't actually have the ability to make a robotic decision and shut everybody down from doing what they may decide is the right thing to do. Now, we are looking at things from a policy standpoint as it relates to a bigger picture. On one hand, you will say, I looked at the law and I realized the law says that I don't need a letter. But because my employer is doing this and there's a possibility that I'm going to lose my job, I think that although the law says this, our church should be willing to give me the letter anyway. Okay. There's a reasonable group of people who would say, if that's what you want to do, it can be done. Maybe that makes your life easier. But there are other people who have put their lives on the line and fought to do certain things to get the law crafted that way. People who had actually lost rights, lost a lot of things to get the law that way. And to now say, well, yeah, that is the law, but we're just trying to make it easier for people under these set of circumstances, can sometimes go to undermining all the work that you've done to actually get that law in place. Now, I can't tell people what they need to do personally as to what they have decided. But if I'm going to put together a policy that says, you know what, we believe that we should force employers to follow the law, I don't view that as a bad policy. And the idea that some employers are not going to follow the law, the idea that, well, let's just us not act like the law exists and just do what we can to be helpful, may not, from a policy standpoint, be the way an organization may want to run either. So I'm just simply saying that, if I tell you that the law says that you should not have to do X, and somebody else comes and tells you, well, you have to do X just because we feel like it, and everyone else doesn't kowtow to what that employer who's actually acting in an illegal way. Now, some people could say, well, just do what you can do to help somebody under those set of circumstances. But sometimes in order to make a position, in order to do what is in the best interest from a long-term standpoint, you can't just accommodate everyone who decides they want to flaunt and do whatever they want to do as it relates to the law. And so, I get where people come from in terms of decisions they thought they need to make. This pastor probably thought about it from the standpoint, I'm going to do this because I believe God has convicted me to do this. But that's not going to change, in my opinion. And I'm always going to look at things on a case-by-case basis, that an organization is going to say, well, because a pastor over here thought it was a good idea to do, then we think that we should probably say that we don't think that anybody should be concerned with the law. Go ahead and craft whatever you want to craft. Because the other thing is that some of the things that pastors may put in the letter, when somebody reads it, they're not going to come back and say that the pastor of the XYZ church or the Seventh-day Adventist church says X. They're going to say the Seventh-day Adventist church says X. That's the reality. And so part of what we're trying to do from a policy perspective is to make sure that we're not putting the church in a position where people are going out crafting information that is being crafted in a way. I mean, you know, these are legal documents that we're kind of talking about, and you can kind of help people as it relates to certain things like Sabbath accommodation, because obviously it's a clear tenet of the church. But to have pastors just kind of drafting letters to try to protect an interest of a parishioner who doesn't really have a legal background and may be putting something out there that could be opening a door in a way that, you know, could create problems down the road is the type of thing that, you know, I think reasonable organizations would say that's probably not a good thing to do. So, you know, I get that people personally have convictions and decide they're going to do what they're going to do. And, you know, and you could tell me, I don't think it's a good idea to speed, Orland, but guess what? Sometimes I do drive 80. And if I drive 80, then sometimes I get pulled over and I got to pay the price for driving 80. But it's a choice that I made based on a set of circumstances in front of me. But I don't get a chance to go to the police and say, hey, you got to disregard that because I was late for church. I mean, so, you know, the bottom line is there are ways that, you know, people can look at this, and I get that there'll be different points of view. But, you know, when you're trying to make hopefully rules and regulations and policy decisions at the top, you're trying to be as consistent as possible and also take into conditions that, you know, there's a specific law and you want to see the law upheld.
Right. Johnson, circle, sorry. Did you have a comment or a reaction to that?
So I think that I resonate with the idea that you don't want the pastor just writing anything. And I know that when I would see some of these pastoral letters that they drafted on their own, a couple times it came to my attention what was done. And I stepped in, and I remember one particular time I called the pastor up and I said, you know, you might want to consider drafting these letters a little bit differently. And I had quite the conversation with him. And initially he was bristling a little bit that I would try to tell him what to do. But I tried to explain to him that, hey, I'm 100% on your side. And I just want to help you put the church in the best light and help you put your parishioner in the best light. And when it was all done, I know he changed his letters. And I did that in the nicest way possible. And I have absolutely no power over him. I'm not a church member. I mean, I'm not a church leader. I'm a member, but not a leader. One of the things that the question you had about why did some places react differently than others? I know from talking to pastors that conference presidents would sit them all down and say, nobody is writing a letter from this conference. Now, I don't know if that happened at all conferences, but it certainly happened at some. And so we would develop a little informal network where we would find out which pastors were willing to write letters. And then when somebody out here in California needed one, we knew who they were. Sometimes, you know, we'd send people halfway across the United States to a pastor that we knew that was willing to write a letter. And this is another thing where I think where it would be really good to have a really good, candid, open conversation about what we might have done right or wrong during this pandemic, because certainly Parle could have done what I did, which was help the pastors write a good letter. If they are going to write a letter, then write a good one. You know, and instead, the basic premise of the church was don't write a letter at all. And that creates a real problem when you have a pastor who's convicted to write a letter. And so then they get no guidance, and then you end up with a letter that isn't the best.
Yeah. So, yeah, pretty interesting. I think, you know, because we're having an open and frank discussion, and I am not a person who sits on any board, but my personal position, and I would challenge anyone to show me biblically where that position is wrong, to put it the nicest way, is that if there's a conference that sits pastors down and says, you cannot write a letter of exemption for your members. That is a wrong thing. I'm willing to go on a limb to just say that that is wrong, because based on the discussion that we're having, that we all know, then that would also be suggestive of imposing on the conscience of that pastor as well. You know, as I highlighted before, in other churches, they didn't seem to have that issue. What I believe would be a workable solution, and hopefully, as Pastor Smith spoke to this, he said, we have a template going forward. Well, I am hopeful that in that template, in terms of going forward, that we can adopt a position that is to respect what Elder Orland said, that is carefully crafted, that does not produce a situation of, you know, without a litigious situation or anything down the road, or that is in violation of the law. But I personally, my personal conviction was that the position of the church globally could have easily and simplistically been that it, like that statement on the website, it should have really said that the church stands with its members who are in agreement with the government mandates, vaccination mandates, etc., and so on and so forth, and also stands with those who are not. And we could simply say, on the basis, the premise of the conscience, which is the foundation on which religious liberty rights are based. And so, if that was to be the position, then an employer could not go and use the church's statements to against the church's own members in that space. I believe that an approach, not necessarily the exact language that I just, but I believe that an approach that from that perspective would have been generic, would have been applicable, and would have been satisfactory, at least for most members. And I believe for many persons that I found, that they agreed with me. They would have agreed with that. I also found I wanted to close the discussion by talking just a little bit. Finally, I know that we've been on a while. By saying this, I saw situations in Canada, in the US, Jamaica even, and I found that even in Jamaica, there's this particular case where this individual worked for a foreign embassy, let's put it that way, and they were relieved of their job because of their refusal to go along with the mandate that was in that country and who was on the employee there. And that person happened to be a Seventh-day Adventist. And ultimately, she was, I would say, exonerated, even though she was put on leave without pay. But what she relayed to me, and there are persons who are part of Time Signs that are lawyers that actually helped to prepare her to make a particular plea, and it was ultimately accepted. But what I noticed that even in Jamaica, what she relayed to me is that when she spoke to pastors who were not conference aligned or employed, they were hesitant. They wouldn't write or sign the letter. When she spoke to pastors who were not conference aligned, they were willing to sign letters and write letters. So it does here, from my perspective, and I found that also here in Canada, I found that in many cases, maybe just one or two pastors, and those pastors would have been ordained pastors, but not conference employed, were willing and able and free to write those letters. And persons just like, there's this one employer in a particular case that literally said, see your letter signed by you, see your letter signed by your pastor. And what you say in your letter is acceptable, but it just does not have the signature of your pastor. So I can't accept it. And literally, the pastor signed that same letter that the employee produced, and they exemption. That pastor was actually not conference employed. And so there is something, Elder Johnson, that is still unnerving about that. But I do appreciate your personal position that individuals ought to, their personal conviction ought to have been considered and exemptions given accordingly. And I take the point, and I kind of embrace the point. Not kind of, I actually embrace the point of Elder Zirkle, who says that regardless, Parle, the church, could have done a better job in terms of ensuring that these individual convictions were respected and found a way in those circumstances to ensure that those individuals were not maligned. And so
I think one last thing, I guess from the North American Division standpoint, if you read what we came out with, our statement was really focusing on the fact that someone could not say that to be vaccinated or to not be vaccinated is a tenet of our church. That was pretty much the statement that we wanted to put out. As a matter of fact, we even made a full statement that says that, while the church's statement recognized that it is not the conscience of the individual church member, recognize individual choices, the choice to be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated is not part of the Seventh-day Adventist Church's doctrine. So we clearly point out that individuals are obviously going to make their own choices. The question that we're getting is, to be vaccinated or to not be vaccinated, is that a tenet of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? And the answer was,
yeah, but
no, period.
But the thing, you got to read the whole statement. I'm assuming your statement tracks the GC statement, and it says specifically. The GC statement is the one that gets read anyway, and what it says specifically is that a Seventh-day Adventist has no business, no right to claim a religious exemption. That's what it says. It says we're not going to be the conscience of anybody, but no Seventh-day Adventist should claim the exemption. It's like you're really speaking out of two sides of the mouth when you do that, and whoever reads that is going to focus in on whichever part of the statement serves their purpose at the moment.
Their purpose, yeah.
Yeah, but Jonathan, everyone does that in the law anyway. You find a statement that best supports your position, and that's the one that you find. Now, I don't have any control over what the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church puts out. The only thing I can be involved in is what the North American Division of the church puts out. And what we clearly did not tell anybody that you have no right to claim anything. Our statement was just simply when we were asked, can you put out a statement saying that to be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated is a tenet of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? And the answer to that is absolutely no. And then we even go on to specify that if you are somebody that has a conscientious belief that should be taken into consideration, that should be something that is an individual choice. But you can't say that you're making that choice because it's a tenet of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. That's the only thing we were talking about in North America. What the GC has in this statement, I have no control over that. Would I want to go that far in a statement from my perspective to tell people, no, I would not, but that's the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and I don't know why they came to that conclusion.
And I don't split hairs between the GC and the NAD, and I'm not here to say what the NAD did wrong and GC is right or whatever,
I separate hairs between the GC and the NAD every day. Every day.
So you know what we can do? On a discussion that we're having, I want somebody to help me to invite Elder Wilson.
Well, there you go.
I'm gonna have him on the platform.
The answer you're looking for, because the reason that we put out a statement was to be very clear that the GC statement was not our statement. So let's be clear. We could have said nothing and rode with whatever they had there, but we wanted to be clear on what we were saying. So if you're talking about a GC/NAD statement, that would not be anything that I could tell you even existed. We have a statement, they have a statement. Our statement is talking about whether vaccination is a tenet of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, to which the answer is no. And then we make a clear statement in our statement saying, but individuals have their right to choose. Now, can we force an employer to do the right thing? No, but all you can do is put in front of them what they're supposed to be doing. Now, the idea of telling somebody what the GC did, I mean, listen, I don't know who makes that call. You know, if I'm there, I'm probably begging hard to go a completely different way, but then I might be just whistling in the wind. But one of the reasons that we needed to put something out from the division standpoint is because everybody was acting, well, if the GC says that, that means the North American division said that, the Inter-American division said that, the other division said that, and we needed to be clear, that's not what we're saying.
Okay.
So I'd love to sit here and defend, but I can't.
Thank you. Well, you know what? I'm happy that you said that. And that distinction. Go ahead, Romain.
One other thing, there are two things that were brought out. I think Zerka brought it out. What the line managers or what the pastors were doing. It could be the case that as pastors, we had different interpretation from what, well, I was in Inter-American at that time. It could be the case that the conversation that the top leadership was having, that the pastors on the ground were not having that conversation. So there was a disconnect. So part of what we need to establish the framework going forward is that the conversation we need to have the conversation so that at all levels we're on the same page. Because I did letters back home.
Okay.
The other persons that didn't, and it wasn't a matter of the position that the church took. A lot of it boiled down to the individual position of the worker.
Yes.
There were certain workers that were mindful that you should take the vaccine. So as such, they would not give you any letter for that accommodation. So if we, as a church, if we can begin to have that conversation with all the players that are involved.
And you should, absolutely. And just to be clear, we didn't put anything out without all of our unions' presidents involved in that process. That was not an independent, create something in a building by yourself. That's in consultation with all 9 of our union presidents. Now, how every one of those union presidents decide that they want to do what they're going to do, I don't know. But, you know, the North American division usually doesn't get involved in anything unless you have multiple unions that are asking you to. We don't sit around looking for, you know, cases to pontificate on and issues to make statements on, because we think that, you know, hearing our voice in the public is something that's important. Normally, our president's getting a call from 2 or 3 presidents who probably know what they want to do and are hoping that they can get, you know, some higher authority to quote unquote potentially support or to be in agreement or to provide cover. But that's a whole nother, you know, above my pay grade type of conversation as opposed to how that works. But trust me, the NAD doesn't wake up on any given day saying, wow, that's going on, we need to put together a statement. It's not until you get 2 or 3 union directors who are saying, we really would like your advice on something. And if you could make that public, that would be very helpful to us. And that's what we try to do. The GC, on the other hand, I don't know who they consult with.
I want to make an observation that I saw.
By asking the last question. So go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it seems like when all this was going down, there was an awful lot of uniformity of response from the church, and we had a lot of communications at all levels of the church, and everybody was acting like they had their hands tied, and it seemed like there was a pretty uniform response. And my other question that I have is that still at our campuses today, especially at our medical institutions, they're requiring the vaccines for the students. And they are doing their best to not provide any kind of exceptions. The schools that have the most problem, and this occurs both at Adventist schools and at non-Adventist schools, I'm getting calls from both places, are the nursing schools. The nursing students are being completely derailed of getting their education if they won't take the vaccine. And I guess I would want to actually ask this question. is the North American division prepared to recognize that someone could have a valid religious objection to the vaccine? And if they do, possibly, if that's theoretically possible, are they at this point willing to support that person? Or are they just going to say, well, we think you've got a religious exemption, but, you know, I got bigger fish to fry. There's other things that are more important. I'm not going to deal with that. You know, and it's very, very frustrating. And this is affecting people's lives.
Jonathan, every decision you
Quick
make
point, Elder Johnson. Yes, go ahead.
impacts people's lives. The idea that we're making decisions because there's no caring about how it impacts the lives of individuals is not how this process goes forward. We made very clear in our statement that an individual can have an individual right to believe that they have a religious support as to why they may want to have this exemption. And they should have the right to fight it tooth and nail. Go to the grave, to the mat, to whatever they need to do with that. The question we were dealing with in North American division is to be vaccinated or not to be vaccinated a tenet of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? Period.
But are you willing now to go to the Adventist institutions and say to them, hey, look, some of your students right now may have a valid religious objection. You shouldn't penalize them. You should help them.
Jonathan, I don't get the power to tell every entity in the Seventh-day Adventist Church what they should do. I can't tell a union what to do. Don't have that power.
So, quick question.
You don't have the moral authority to speak. I mean, you have the power to go into Congress and talk to my representative. Why can't you talk to the president of one of our universities?
My moral authority is very clear in the statement that we put out regarding what we believe your rights are. It can't be any clearer.
Understood. So I have a question, Elder Johnson.
Yes.
The university, because I didn't even realize. Now, just thinking back to what Elder Circle had said earlier about a student, he actually said our university, and not just a general regular university. And I also remember during the pandemic that there was this non-religious, just a secular report on one of the major news agencies, and one researcher that defended students in that context actually shared that she found that the schools, universities that were vociferous in refusing vaccine exemptions for students were the Jesuit universities. And when she said that, I was like, what? And I actually went and researched that a little bit. But my question was more, so who is it the North American division, or is it the General Conference that administers or supervises or universities, like let's say in the United States, or does it, or are they independent of the GC and NC?
The North American division has, I believe, one university that is under its purview.
Oh, and the rest are under GC?
Correct.
Okay, so that answer is very important to me, because guess what? Next file, I'll be asking President Wilson this question. And I'm going to ask Pastor Smith to help me. I'm going to send him an email. I'm going to ask Elder Wilson, please, we need to have a discussion. And the outstanding things here, I'm willing to pose them to him, because, like, I'm sure I speak on behalf of quite a number of individuals in the church who really want to have a few answers to that question. But we're out of time, but I just wanted to allow you a final comment. So as we go forward, this morning I did a sermon and I mentioned Desmond Doss. And you're very familiar, I'm sure, with his case, with his situation where he was this conscientious objector in the U.S. military that insisted that he would go to war, but he would not take a gun. He would not use a gun because he didn't believe in killing. And God actually so protected him that the enemy could not shoot him, even when they had him squarely in their sights. The guns jammed because they could not, God would not allow them to pull the trigger. But what is interesting about him is that the army didn't want to accept his position necessarily, that he would not bear arms, but they didn't really have a legal right to not allow him to participate. And I imagine in my view that he was able to save almost 100 lives himself just by being on the battlefield as a medic. And when I reflect on it, I ask myself the question: if he were to, if it was said to him by the army that, you cannot get this exemption. I know you want to be a soldier, but we cannot allow you. You have to show me that your church actually says in its doctrinal statement that you are not supposed to bear arms. And if it came down to that for him to be a member in the army, then he possibly could not be, because he possibly would not be able to show that that's one of our fundamental tenets. But that was his conscientious objection, and that was his conscience. And in hindsight, we know that it was the voice of the Holy Spirit that was actually talking to him. And he was able to make that decision. He was accommodated, and he was able to save so many lives on the battlefield by the help of God. And so I say that to say that a lot of the times we have as a church to be very, very careful to appreciate that even if something may not be in our fundamental beliefs, but it can be substantiated by scripture, it ought to receive the full support of the church, because we can be shutting out the voice of God. And in the pandemic, we found situations where people were seriously convicted, and that conviction came from the Holy Spirit. And luckily, they stood their ground on those convictions, and they were able to avoid certain calamities because of that conviction. And so it is very important for us to move in tandem with the Holy Spirit. So my last question, just one line request from each of you is, looking forward, as we know as a church, we've had a pandemic, we may have one more in the future, and we also have situations like the Sunday laws coming that we are looking forward to based on Bible prophecy. As a officer in the church, as a worker in the church, in your various capacities, what would you like to see the church, how would you like to see the church position itself as we face those coming crises? How would you respond to that question? Hopefully you understand this.
Well, from my perspective, were you speaking to me? I'm sorry.
Yes, Elder Johnson first, and then Pastor Smith, and then Elder Zirkle, and then I will turn over to my Elder Daly.
Yeah, I mean, I think the church wants to be positioned so that it can be able to protect our members and our organizations in the best way possible by going out and being consistent, and going out and letting people know what we believe from our church's perspective and the foundation of our church, that we want to be covered. I think you have to be precise. I think you have to be distinct. But I also think we have to be clear that no matter what we end up with, there's somebody who will try to run afoul of it. We got a lot of great laws in the United States that should be protecting a whole lot of people in the United States. But I bet you there's a group of people in the United States that will tell you they don't feel as protected as they'd like to be. Because at the end of the day, you do the best that you can in order to put things in place. You do the best that you can in order to make sure that laws are enforced. But at the end of the day, people still have to choose to abide. And that's the part that I'm not sure we'll ever have any control of. But I just want our church to be willing to be out on the forefront and to understand that you can do the best that you can. And there'll be times where you don't win, but that doesn't mean you don't fight the fight. And do everything you can to protect your members, and to do it in a way that hopefully in the long run, it seems to be something that makes sense. And that's where I would like to see our church. I mean, I'm a guy who spent most of his life working outside the building. I practiced law for 25 years. The idea that I'd ever be a church employee was not on the bucket list. And therefore, my life as to what I do here is to hopefully try to best position my church to be in a position so that we can best be able to get people ready to one day see Jesus. And at the end of the day, that's what I view my job to be. And I'm hoping that my church will be positioned to make that happen.
Thank you, Leon. Thank you, Ella Johnson. I believe that as a church, the question of religious liberty is going to be more significant going forward. There are many questions that we are being challenged with even different rights groups that are posing a challenge to the religious liberty that we enjoy and the faith that we enjoy. It is important for us as a church to learn from what has transpired in the past and to build on that going forward. We can't correct what has already happened. There were errors made on every side. As pastors, we made decisions that on hindsight, we could have done differently. So it is not pointing finger as to who was at fault or that has happened. There are greater challenges that are to come. And we know that. What we can do as a church, we can prepare our members for those challenges that are to come. We can educate ourselves through sessions like these for those challenges that are to come. And one of the points that Ella Johnson made earlier, I'm coming from a context in Jamaica where almost the entire population is aware of Seventh-day Adventism, what we believe, what are our core beliefs. I am now in Canada where persons don't even know who is a Seventh-day Adventist. That is one of the challenges that affects us as a people. They therefore means that as a church, more public relation, more presentation of who we are as a church, so that it can be easier for members in their place of employment, that the church is readily known what are the beliefs, known what are the impacts that we are making in our community, so that there's a level of respect that is given towards the church, which is also beneficial to the members. So with the challenges that are to come, the church needs to do more public affairs, more public relation, so that our community is more sensitized as to what we believe as a church, so that our church members can benefit from that goodwill that we build.
Thank you so much, Elder Zirkle.
It's a little hard to know what to say in this situation. I think that we do need to look at what we did right, what we did wrong, and learn from it. But there's a much bigger picture going on here. And we all recognize that. We're Seventh-day Adventists. As Elder Johnson said, we've read the end of the book and we know how it all ends. And I think that, I was thinking about one of my friends who runs a radio station in Europe, and he took a very different stance than what our church did here. He was constantly taking a prophetic view of what was going on, and he says that now he says people are coming to him that are not Seventh-day Adventists from across Europe, and they're saying, "Thank you for the warning that you gave us." And he took a different approach to the vaccine. I've always taken the approach that people should have the choice, but he was more of a warning of not taking the vaccine. Now people are thanking him for the position that he took, and that was a position that I think our church didn't want to take. We didn't want to be opposed to the powers that be. But I've worked for. I had a big case once that involved pharmaceuticals and specifically research on them. And I knew going into this, I know what it takes to actually have a drug be declared safe. And I also know that even if it's declared safe, it probably isn't, but at least it's safer. And I just knew that this wasn't possible, that anyone could possibly declare this vaccine safe. And I think that even in this amount of time that we've had today, it's still too early to know, although the data isn't good. But I also think that we really need to be warning the world, and the next pandemic is coming. I'm certain that there's going to be at least an attempt at it. And you can label people conspiracy theorists, but I know what the UN is discussing. I know what the World Health Organization is discussing, and I know that people will want to brand anyone who talks about the UN or what's going on there as a conspiracy theorist. But the reality is the reality. It's there. It's happening. I believe our church should be at that level advocating, because there's things there that are happening that are very concerning from a religious liberty standpoint and a liberty standpoint. And I just want to point out, before everyone accuses everybody of conspiracy theory, you know, it isn't just the three angels message and just the Sunday law that we know that's coming down the pipe. And, you know, we have the blessing of Spirit of Prophecy to help us to be sure that we're on the right track when we study Revelation. And I would just like to point out and remind Seventh-day Adventists of our position on Revelation chapter 17. And when you look in there, Revelation chapter 17 and verse 12, it talks about how there are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet, but received power as kings 1 hour with the beast. These have one mind and shall give their power and strength unto the beast. And I'll tell you what the big take home I see from the pandemic and any future pandemics, whether we have one or not, is we are seeing the world coordinate itself now more and more for the response to these events and taking away liberty. And as that blueprint takes place, this is a learning experience for both the people of God and for those that oppose us. And it's not going to be hard to shift. Today, we may be talking about a liberty of health. You know, we believe our body's the temple of God. This is absolutely religious liberty. But it isn't going to be that far until there's a shift to what we see as the traditional fear that we're concerned about, specifically Sunday laws. And I just think that the time to speak up now, the time to actually teach true principles of liberty, we should be shouting those from the mountaintop. We need to be talking about our heritage. We need to be proudly stating, you know, the only reason why I have any liberties in this country is because there was a Puritan pastor who advocated for that. That's the reason why. This all comes from Christianity. This all comes from the Bible. We're missing an opportunity, and we need to learn from this. And I really, really, really believe in preaching the message, the gospel. And as I've been doing that with religious liberty, I've been shocked and amazed at how many times I end up really giving the three angels message, because really, if you look at the three angels messages, it's all about liberty and oppression. Anyway, so I just hope great things for our church. The church is very dear to my heart. I pray for it all the time. I support it every which way I can. I want everyone to know. Sometimes people think that because I maybe disagree with some of the leadership in the church, that somehow I don't like or support the church. That couldn't be farthest from the truth. I love the church. I love Jesus. I love the time we're living in, and I'm so in awe that God would give us prophecy so that we could know where we're at, so that we can be rational players in all of this. So, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. And can I just say to our panelists, on behalf of the leadership, the pastoral leadership, and the elders of the Woodbridge of the Adventist Church, that we really appreciate your time. We are heartened by your response, the respect, a lot. Just by a simple invitation, you were willing to come and to have this discussion. Elder Orland Johnson, we really appreciate you. Elder Zirkle, we really appreciate you. And the leadership of Pastor Smith, I say thanks to all of you. I'll allow Pastor Smith to close, if anything, but I see two hands. Now, unfortunately, let me apologize that that we did not state at the beginning, but we also kind of suspected that we might not have had the time to have questions posted in the chat. But at the next opportunity, and we'll be doing some more discussions with Paul, we will be accepting and allowing you to voice your opinion, to share your comments and questions in a particular format. And so we really do appreciate your attendance here. I want to give my last word to Elder Daly, but I see a hand by Anthony. I'm not so sure who that is. If you are able to make your point very, very quickly, like 30 seconds, I will give you that opportunity, and then I will ask Elder Daly to just come in, tie things up. and then Pastor will Anthony.
Yes, good afternoon. I just want to, we talk about we know that religious liberties is of different angle. And we talk about the right to assemble for religious worship. But we want to look at the other aspect. As Protestantism, we know that the truth gradually unfold, and the individual members of the church have a right to investigate for themselves without anyone imposing between them and God. So the question is, do people in the church really have religious freedom to do that?
All right. So do people in the church, do people in the church have religious freedom too?
To do that.
To do that? Sorry, I'm sorry. I was talking and I actually missed the question.
Freedom to study on their own, Anthony?
Or just
No, in the Protestant world, we have many Protestant churches, and as we know that the truth of redemption gradually unfolds to the member of the church, and there are individuals who interpose between that individual and the light that heaven is sending to them, and therefore is very, very detrimental to the individual soul. And so we should grant that religious liberty to the members to do that, to decide for themselves.
yes, absolutely. And I think we all would agree with you and will agree on that. And I think our panelists basically summarily made that point as well. So thank you so much for that contribution. Elder Daly, over to you.
Thank you so much, Elder Leon. You know, I'm gonna hand over back to Pastor Smith to finish up. But I just want to say, you know, because there was no one from the General Conference here, and you know, one of the things I embrace and I love about the Seventh Adventist Church is the way it's structured. Not really want to speak on behalf of the General Conference. You know, I listened to a documentary with Dr. Finley concerning something else on the 3ABN and the way how the General Conference function. You know, he mentioned that they are not like dictators to dictate over every institution, tell them what to do and so forth. But we realized that the way the church is structured, you know, the General Conference have to be managing the world church, different cultures, different countries that deal with issues differently, different continents. And so they have to put things in place and delegate authority to the different divisions and conferences so that are actually on the ground in different countries or different continents to actually respond to certain situations. So, you know, I think sometimes we might want the General Conference to make a statement that is going to affect everyone in every continent, every country, and it can be difficult. And so I see where now it can fall up on in the hands of the divisions to take on some of those challenges, because it would be more difficult for the General Conference to deal with it at their level. I don't know if Elder Johnson will want to kind of, I know we are finishing, to kind of put some light onto that fact that it's more challenging for the General Conference to make one statement to take off everything around the world. It's easier to delegate to different divisions because it's because of communication, because of culture, and so forth.
No, I think that's a valid point. And so when you get a statement from the General Conference, they're not looking at it as being a statement for the 1 million Adventists in the United States or the 1.2 million Adventists in the division. They're making a statement for the 24 or 25 million Adventists around the world. And so, and so how they come to their decisions based on those type of statements, I think it's a very unique set of circumstances that I would never be in a position to deal with. So what we try to do is when we see that there's a statement that the GC comes out with that creates some issues from the North American division standpoint, we try to make some clarifications. I mean, we don't want to open up another can of worm here, but, the whole conversation regarding women's ordination kind of fell into that category. You've got a construct that comes from the General Conference, and then the divisions look at it from the standpoint that might be creating some issues for us that don't work, and they try to create their own workarounds to make them happen. And I think we're just going to see that happen over and over and over again because of the different layers. At the end of the day, the real power in the church is at the unions. The unions call the shots. The unions tell the conferences what to do. The unions own the assets of the church. The North American division doesn't own one single asset of any church in the United States. And so that's where the structure really is. And that's where the power really is. Now, it doesn't mean that sometimes organizations don't ask for your assistance, but be clear on where the real power is and who makes the call. It's really the unions. And so you got these different structures that every union's in a different part of the world, and the culture and all of that comes into play. So yeah, I understand the General Conference job. It's a very tough job to make a statement that impacts 24 million people, in every walk of this world. That's a tough call, but that's part of the job. That's part of the job.
Thank you so much, Pastor Smith.
We want to take this opportunity to thank Elder Johnson, Elder Kirtle for coming, for taking the time to share with us. We know that both gentlemen, that your schedule is very busy, and for the fact that you would have made the effort, clear your schedule to be here with us, we want to render how appreciative we are for the time and for the information that you have shared with us. And we pray that for those of us who were here present, that the information would have been beneficial. We hope that we asked most of your questions, and that even where there are points of disagreements, we still leave in understanding the viewpoints of each individual. So we want to say thanks to our panelists. We want to say thanks to Ella Leon for making this program possible. And we want to thank you for your effort, Sir Elder, in putting this panel together, putting the discussion together. And we pray God's richest blessing on all of us who are present. We're going to pray and close. Just want to remind you that we still continue our 10 days of prayer. So we look forward to seeing you as we pray and ask God for continued guidance in the challenges that are to come. Father, we thank you. We thank you for your presence with us. And we thank you, Lord, for how relevant religious liberty is in our time. We recognize that as a people, as individuals, that there are greater challenges that are to come. And Lord, we pray for your Holy Spirit, and we pray for wisdom. And we pray for each individual in our churches. And we ask that you will provide the wisdom and the knowledge and the understanding that is necessary to navigate the challenges that are before us. We ask that you may continue to keep us, that you may continue to be with our panelists. Lord, that in the areas that they serve, grant wisdom so that the decisions that are made for the growth and the development of your people and for the best interests of your church. Continue to be with us as we look forward to a new week. Go before us, Lord, and we ask that you will give your angels charge over us, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for participating. Thanks again to our guests, to panelists. Really appreciate
Thank you.
all over. And it was a pleasure having you. Until next time, from Parl, we say, well, it's no longer Happy Sabbath, but have a great rest of the week. God bless you.
Thank you.